Hello and welcome to Inside Grantmaking. I'm Alex Blake, a trust fundraising consultant with 20 years of experience helping charities to secure major grants. The decisions funders make shape which communities get support and which charities can survive and thrive. But we don't often hear about the thinking behind those decisions or the questions funders themselves are grappling with. That's what this podcast series is all about. Each episode, I hold honest, practical conversations with people working at Grantmakers to share how funding decisions are made and the big issues in the grant-making field. I'm delighted to announce that today I'm speaking to Jim McCormick from the Robertson Trust, and in the next couple of episodes, I'll be speaking to Safina Ahmed from John Ellerman Foundation and Alex Jacobs from the Joffrey Trust. Welcome to the podcast, Jim. How are you today?
Pleasure to be here, Alex. Good to meet you. The sun is trying to shine here in Glasgow, and we're hurtling towards end of June, which is when the Scottish summer holidays tend to begin.
Yeah, sun's trying to come out here in Newcastle as well, but failing miserably at the moment. So why don't we start off just with a bit of sort of introduction, just tell us a little bit about the Robertson Trust, what you're focused on. Obviously your role there as the chief exec. So yeah, just a bit of context in terms of what the foundation's focused on and any recent developments.
So we're a truly independent grant maker for Scotland. We're just over halfway through a decade-long strategy. Our mission commits us to build solutions to poverty and trauma, and we do that both by responding in the here and now to immediate needs and trying to prevent in the longer term and get upstream. And we have two broad grant making channels, if you like, that allow us to try and do both rather than make impossible trade-offs between them. Our income is from two sources. We have an endowment, but it's topped up by ongoing dividend income from the very successful whisky company, which we continue to be the majority owners of. That's about just over half of our income, and the other half is from investment income from our pooled investments. Those income sources are what allow us to be completely independent and to go at this strategy with a decent run to the end of the decade, making the best choices we can to move money, to move investments behind our big goals to the best of our ability, and driven by a really good and clear impact framework, a learning approach that we've put in place in the last year or so.
I saw on your website you've got quite a mix of funding there in terms of small and large. Some of the stuff that's more about having an impact now, some longer terms as a mix of systems change and project delivery. So I don't know how different things are from one area to another, but what I wanted to ask you was, from when a charity seeking funding from you, what the process is for them making inquiries, making applications and so on, and what the process is on your side of things, kind of initial assessment and going through the process to decision making. If you can take that across the program, then great. Or if it carries a lot from one grant program to another, maybe we just take a big large grant program as the example, perhaps.
Okay, well, through our distinct funding channels, we run the same thematic priorities, and that also drives our learning approach. So, for example, everything we're doing, from the tiniest grant to the largest, on the theme of education or of financial security, we try and do that kind of thematic integration. But we are moving towards a more common model across our funding streams, in that we want to be always open across them rather than do time-specific open-close. We've normally balanced always open with some open-close in our larger programs. And since April of this year, we have switched on a new approach to what we're now calling big change grants, and those are our system change upstream funding strands. We're opening that so you can apply to us at any point when you've got that kind of big idea for change, and we'll do it theme by theme. And we'll open a second theme later this year until we're fully open. That accounts for about a third of our grant making. 2/3 of our grant making is locked into our open responsive channel, where at most times, for most of those strands, they're open. Occasionally we pause and we refocus how we target some of those funds. Usually that's to avoid getting very broad in terms of mission drift. Of course, there are also financial pressures. So I think in common with lots of other funders, if we're seeing demand grow and complexity of demand grow from our applicants faster than our budgets grow, then we have tougher choices and our success rate starts to trend downwards. But you asked me about the experience for applicants. So if we take our large grants, and that's targeting charities in Scotland with an income of between £200,000 and up to £2 million. That's the kind of year we're focusing on there. There are grants above that and below that, but for this conversation, for illustration, large grants can now go up to 5-year funding at £50,000 a year. We typically would be funding at no less than 3 years. In the last few months, we've managed to start making a small but growing number of 4 and 5 year awards. But what I'm really pleased about is we've managed to move to just a shade below 60% of those open grants being unrestricted. So they're multi-annual, not as long as we'd like them to be, but we've gone from below 40% to around about 60% in the last 3 years. More to go for sure. And we're really interested in some of the reasons why charities might opt for project restricted funding, even if core is available. Sometimes that happens too, but by and large, that's the kind of journey we're on to try and apply the IVAR principles of open and trusting grant making. The last thing to say before pause would be we are very open to applicants coming back to us. So within 6 months of the end of a grant, the doors open, come back and start talking to us early on. And we try as hard as we can to avoid cliff edges and gaps in funding. We don't ask folks to wait a year before they come back. And the success rate for strong returning applicants is exceptionally high.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've got a theory on why charities might apply for project funding when core funding is available as well. And I think often it's just that they think they have a better chance of success when the options are there. I think if as a funder you're very clear, really invested in unrestricted funding, support the IFR principles and all the rest of it, then I think it gives people more confidence to go to. But I think often when there's both options available, and particularly if you're a new applicant, then people think, yeah, they're probably going to be more successful if they put a project forward. Just, I suppose, because historically that's been, the thing that funders have preferred. So I think, yeah, that's probably why you see still, even when you give the option, that people don't always take it up.
Our funding team are very proactive in when we spot an applicant where we think there's every reason why this could be an unrestricted award because of alignment. Very often people are surprised but delighted by the option of unrestricted because it's still too rare in our sector and we do need to have a bit of a system shift in this direction. So very often that switch happens during the assessment period. We still see though, even after that, some saying we prefer project restricted, and it's often to do with how charities feel they wish to account for their income, how boards expect them to account for restricted revenues. If 90% of your other funding is restricted, some charities see the 10% as a godsend. If it's unrestricted, others prefer to stick with what the rest of the mix looks like. It's a complicated picture. I think we need more evidence about it. I definitely don't think we've hit a ceiling at just about 60%. We've set a target to go above that in the next couple of years, but it's getting a bit harder to continue the rate of progress and the rate of increase on core.
Yeah, and I can see where there's a place for project funding in your portfolio as well, because there might be an organisation where some of their work fits your theme and some of it doesn't. They've
Exactly.
got a project, but because it's mixed, you wouldn't be able to just give them core funding because then it could go towards work that's not in line with your charitable objects, and then you'd miss out on that kind of opportunity. So that's where it has a place as well. I wanted to ask just briefly before we move on about the difference between the open-close versus the always open kind of approach, and whether you see that having a big impact in terms of the number of applications you receive.
I think it's two flavours of surge is what's going on at the moment in terms of demand. So in our open responsive, we started to see maybe a year ago, certainly 9 months ago, a very significant upward trend in applications. Some of them not quite of the quality we have seen previously, and it's certainly the case that very generic use of AI is driving applications across the funding landscape. There's no surprise there. And, in common with others, we've got very clear guidance on, what we see as very appropriate use of AI, but there is always a human element. There's always a kind of unique story in your organization's, reason for existence and what you do and who for and why that, needs to come through your application. So there's a limit to how far you can just apply AI. Within the open close, what we have called previously program awards and now big change grants they're called. So we've typically been open for 3 months, theme by theme. And it varies, but we saw very significant numbers of applications in most cases. We have used a two-stage process to make sure we're not wasting applicant time or our time on applications that are unlikely to be a fit in the end. And we're going to apply that same two-stage process to our large grants when they fully reopen by the end of August. On the basis that, it's a bit of a cliche, Alex, but on the basis that a quick no is the second best answer.
Yeah.
We're trying to apply that principle in line with our values and transparently.
And what's the process look like at your end when an application comes in at each stage of the process? Who looks at it? How do they assess it and decide whether it moves forward or not? Does it then get shared with either wider staff team and onto board of trustees?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we apply in our assessment decision making the same principle of proportionality as we do in our impact and insight expectations. So we go from micro grants that we call wee grants up to large grants and then above to big change grants. And there's a sliding scale. So if we take large grants again, because that's where it's not the biggest number of awards we make, but it's the biggest share of our open grant making, we would have a funding officer doing the assessment. We would have a manager doing a review of that assessment. We would have a second set of manager eyes on the review for quality assurance and consistency in most cases. And then it would come to a decision meeting. We have 10 of those throughout the year to try and keep the cycle flowing. And the two ultimate decision makers would be the head of funding, my colleague Patrizia, and myself for those grants. Now, below that level, there's more delegation into the team. Above that level, it depends on the size of the grant. And that would be in our big change grants category. And the delegation thresholds are always subject to review, but some of our larger grants above that level would go to our board automatically, and some we would take to the board on the grounds of where we're taking more risk in pursuit of our mission, where we're seeing something very novel, or a first-time applicant or a new collaboration, something that's not typical. We might choose to take that to our board either for feedback or for decision. So we've got a bit of discretion, but there are thresholds above which we would automatically seek and require board approval. But I hope that gives you a flavour of quite how delegated our decision-making is, certainly in comparison to some of our peers. I think we have very significant delegations and therefore trust and responsibility placed in our team.
That assessment that's being done at the different levels, what are the key points that you're looking at? I assume there's some kind of initial due diligence things to tick off, and then once you're looking at the content of those applications, what is it?
So we would apply, and again there's a proportionality here, but as we go up the scale we apply up to 4 decision frames. So we will always be scoring an application on its strength of alignment around poverty and related trauma. And that might be a very clear story around the people and or the places you're serving. But it isn't just looking for evidence of need. It's trying to understand the response to that need. So what's your What's your operating model? What's your pathway to change? And the bigger the award, the more we'd be looking for in terms of change and prevention. We also look for the extent to which an organisation is close to its community and reflective of its community. So we might look at staff and board composition. We would look at how collaborative, so the kind of strength of relationships. And we also, where appropriate, not in every case, but where appropriate, we look to the extent to which organisations are advancing equity goals around race or around disability, around upholding rights. Those are frames we also apply to some of our bigger partners. So it just gives a flavour of how we do it. The challenge is definitely to do with rising demand, and that means as we go through this financial year, there's every possibility that applications that in previous years would have met the threshold may not, just because of the intensity of competition. It's something we worry about all the time. We worry that, funders end up driving competition for scarce resources when we'd all love to be, trying to create the conditions for more collaboration, but hard to collaborate if you can't keep the lights on. So we understand the absolute bedrock importance of the foundations for an organisation before you can expect the right kind of collaboration for the long term. And that allows us to switch between those two different funding streams to do two things. And a growing number of organisations have funding from both of those types of grant in recognition of just that point about both responding here and now and doing longer term change work.
What do you look at outside of that application document? Do you look at kind of on your reports and websites, and do you have conversations with people as well? How much communication do you have with applicants aside from what they present to you?
Yeah, so there would always be an assessment call. Those are less out and about on the road than they used to be pre-COVID. We tend to focus our on-the-road time with grant holders in terms of listen and learn engagement. We were out on the road on Monday in Fife actually this week doing just that with a couple of our trustees. But we would have a dedicated officer has an assessment call. If it's a returning applicant, then we will have seen annual reports, but also an end of grant report coming or already in the system. So we'll have more recent insight into how those organisations are faring. For first-time applicants or those we haven't seen for a long time, we would spend more time just building the picture. And of course, we would look at, Oscar, the regulator, we'd look at websites, but there's no substitute for the conversation and trying to get to a very honest, between the lines conversations. Not always straightforward, but I think we've got a team that does this pretty skillfully. And signals, we don't expect everything to be in place on day one. We do understand that in the real world, delivery imperatives mean that they may be different from your plan when you first apply for funding. We try and apply ability once we've got to a point of enough assurance about an organisation and what they want to do. But we always try and apply proportionality. A £1,000 grant is not the same as what we look for in a £40,000 grant per year.
When you do fund organisations, you mentioned you go out and visit people and learn. How involved do you get with organisations in terms of the communication you have with them, and whether you provide additional support, whether you do any of that kind of sharing of the learning, bringing different grantees together for shared learning and collaboration and that type of thing?
I guess there are two strands to that. So over and above the grant holder visits, where we can only ever be, one location per month, really. So that's the kind of really valuable but limited look through, if you like. A couple of things to say. On top of the grant, we've got a really good and improving Funder Plus offer. We managed to make one of my colleagues, Lorna, for her to take on more of a dedicated Funder Plus role, and that's paying dividends. So we're moving towards more of a, not just a kind of menu-driven approach for grant holders. So, for example, do you need support with digital or with business planning or finance, but also to add more demand-led Funder Plus approaches where organisations receive a budget and they shape it, of course within limits, but they shape what they need. There's a lot of support happening around preventing burnout, around trauma-informed practice, around what rural organisations need in terms of leadership. So that's the kind of There's a whole other story. We could spend half an hour on that. But I guess on convening, well, one of our values is connection. And we are so fortunate to have a really excellent conference centre in Stirling, which is bang in the heart of the Central Belt in Scotland, and excellent connectivity for folks to get there. And every quarter, we have what we call a collective sense-making session. And we bring together decent number of grant holders from across Scotland, but alongside them we bring Scottish Government and trustees and other people who we think are important voices around that theme. And last year we took one theme per quarter, and that led to an impact report as the result. This year we're doing it a little differently. We're doing it around the kind of cross-cutting pillars of our plan. So back in April we convened for the day around the themes of prevention, system change and empowerment. And so that's across all of our themes, but looking for partners who are trying to break new ground with those goals in mind, but also to have a really understand the kind of real world view of what helps, but also what hinders that kind of work. And there are plenty of headwinds getting in the way, but it's so inspiring to hear firsthand from grant holders how they are managing, in many cases, to get round those roadblocks and try and keep on track with some of those very big long-term goals. So yeah, there's no substitute for face-to-face time spent together.
Yeah, the convening and that side of things is probably another one we could have another half-hour conversation about. I think both of those aspects really add a lot of value for the organisations you're supporting. Mindful of time, I won't dig too deep into either of those, and I'll move on to ask you a bit of a sort of question, just in terms of trends in grant-making practice, things that maybe you've been seeing in the grant-making field more broadly, and things you've been thinking about and discussing, and how that's impacting on some of the changes that you've been making.
Yeah, I think it's a few things showing up for us and our colleagues. So there's a great deal of interest now in pooled funding models, and we've got some great examples in Scotland. There's an event coming up from IVAR later in the month on this, actually, like the Human Rights Fund, like the Edinburgh Regenerative Futures Fund, where 6, 7 or 8 funders will come together, find enough common ground across our respective missions and trust deeds, and decide we can do more together than separately. In the case of the Edinburgh Fund, a condition for some of us was, well, the City Council has to have skin in the game also. And that's a 10-year fund of £15 million. So there are some small and some big examples of pooled funding. And I think it's a fair criticism to the funding sector to say we often talk a good game in collaboration and we too rarely practice what we preach. So these growing examples, all different flavours, are really interesting. And beyond the principle of pooling, we also see more of them apply a delegated decision-making model where, with training and with appropriate support from grant makers and our expertise, communities can step into the decision-making role for themselves. So that's one very important trend. I suspect we're just in the foothills of it. What else to say? I think the more we can develop blended offers rather than choose A, B or C for the people we're here for, the better. So I talked earlier about a growing number of organisations able to be funded through 2 grant streams from the Robertson Trust. We're also working ever so gradually, but we're working on social investment opportunities that will allow, on top of grants, affordable lending to be drawn down. So currently we don't have a capital grants offer. We've got a community spaces fund which does great things around places to convene, building community capital and cohesion, but it isn't about capital expenditure. And we're thoughtful about, well, how could we help to bring forward a mix of loan and grant capital for those who want to build or refurbish youth spaces or community hubs or innovate new products and services for which grants in isolation probably don't get you there. So blended offers that give more choice to charities and social enterprises. Funder plus offers, so additional things on top of the grant, really important. And that idea of more choice to grant holders through demand-driven approaches to Funder Plus, all those strike us as being, they're by no means new trends, but they seem quite important trends given how volatile and polarised the environment we're all working in currently.
It sounds like there's an awful lot of change afoot at the trust there. Has it always been that way? Have you always been kind of iterating and learning and reviewing and making changes, or is that a newer thing that you're trying so many different things?
If I trace back to before my time, Alex, so before 2020 and 1, 2, 3 strategies ago, I can see how we've developed a scholarship programme for young people from widening access backgrounds, which is now 30 years old. I can see how we've tried to create bridging funding agreements with local authorities, not binding legally, but trying to drive more collaboration around really crunchy, difficult areas which don't attract a lot of funding historically. And I can see some really targeted but successful influencing activity more than 10 years ago around criminal justice, for example. So there is a tradition at the Robertson Trust and amongst our peers of this kind of work. I'd say since 2020, there has been a lot of change, but we've tried to build it incrementally. I suspect there are as many of my colleagues who think we've gone too slow as we've gone too fast, depending on your perspective. And rather than continuing to build lots of new things, we're now at a point where it's about how we mature and improve the set of offers we've got. But that point fundamentally about how we collaborate, not just with other funders, but how we get alongside other sectors. So if we could get closer to whole place integrated funding, our local authorities are not just doing substitution because we step in, they step back. That doesn't help anybody. But can we do more collaborative long-term funding with a small number of local authorities who are ready for it, and they're definitely out there. So that isn't breaking new ground, but it's trying to build it more into our model rather than it being kind of ad hoc if capacity allows, which I think is what it's been for lots of us thus far.
Okay, well, I'm mindful of time. I'm going to let you go shortly. So just one final question then. Is there one thing that you'd want fundraisers to understand about how you work?
I think take a look at not just our funding guidance, but our blogs and our impact reports on a sampling basis. If you spot gaps, information you don't think is as up to date as it needs to be, please come and tell us. I think what you do, what Joe Jeffrey does at the list, what others are doing to help our sector as a whole improve is so valuable. I think there needs to be a challenge function to grant holders. We're big enough to take it. We should be committed to improvement. We don't get everything right all the time by any means. And there may be a very respectful two-way challenge back, for example, around AI guidance, where we think there needs to be more of a shared view around good, responsible, appropriate use. But I think let's build bridges, let's improve communication, feedback loops, and let's all get focused around what better practice looks like. The list, IVAR, ACF are all helpful in this sense, but it's a crowded landscape out there. There's information overload, so intermediaries who can help us pick through such a cluttered, noisy landscape are worth their weight in gold.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting. And as you say, it's a complex picture, so there's lots going on, isn't there? But the more communication there is, the better, I think. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insights and telling us more about how the Trust works. It's all been really helpful. I hope it's helpful for people out there thinking about applying.
Thanks for the invite, Alex. Pleasure to spend time with you.
Thanks for listening to Inside Grantmaking. If you found this conversation useful, please follow the show wherever you get your podcast. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can find me on LinkedIn or via the Kida Consulting website.